Everything starts with Elisity Cloud Control Center in our platform. Our solution is very, very straightforward, but when we designed it, we wanted to be 100% software, require no agents, and be cloud delivered, right? Those are the three main things that you're going to hear from anybody selling or talking about Elisity. We've taken, as Mary had mentioned, thank you, that was an awesome question, because it's like it set me up perfectly. It's like, right? It's perfect. We've taken all the complexity you're so used to dealing with, upgrading switches, configuring this port, putting this collector in the network, deploying this big appliance, all that's gone. And it's been abstracted, and we've handled it in Cloud Control Center, which is, of course, a cloud-delivered control plane. It's our cloud-delivered policy plane. It's our identity engine. It's our UI. It's where you interact with the API. It's where you integrate other platforms, either whether they're cloud platforms or on-prem, with Cloud Control Center. So it's really a set of microservices. And I'm so actually happy to have Piotr with me here today, because Piotr was one of the main architects for the microservices behind Cloud Control Center. And so any questions around that, I'm just going to ask him to answer them. Straightforward. But customers subscribe to our solution, and they get the keys to the kingdom, and they log into Cloud Control Center. What's next? There's one thing on-premise that they need to deploy. One little piece of software, one gig app called the Virtual Edge. And think of this as our secure conduit between the on-premise infrastructure that's private and should stay private, and the public cloud infrastructure that, by the way, is single tenant and completely locked down to a customer. Nobody else can access it, and it is single tenant. But it's, of course, CSP delivered. So it's that secure conduit between the private network and the public cloud network. And the Virtual Edge is deployable. Is that a word, deployable? Yeah, it can be deployed as within a hypervisor. It can be deployed centrally. It can be deployed locally at a site. It's so lightweight that it can even be deployed as an app within a switch. We know that some switches today, Catalyst 9000 series switches, beautiful, amazing switches, they support running applications. And you can run that app within the switch itself. If you have a remote site that doesn't have any local compute, but you have a 9300 or a 9400 or 9500, pop our app in there and away you go. It's doing what it needs to do. Deploying the Virtual Edge, again, is what customers have to do, but it's a 15-minute endeavor. Like I said, it's packaged up as a very simple app. All you do is give it an IP address, subnet mask, a default gateway, some DNS information, and you generate a token in Cloud Control Center and pop that token into the Virtual Edge, and it calls home and onboards itself. Gets everything it needs, it registers, and it's done. So you can deploy this at scale. You can do a bunch of these if you want to script it out too. But manually, Dana, me, I've done this a million times. I can do it in like 15 minutes. And most of that time is waiting for the VM to boot up the app. Once it's deployed and it calls home and registers with Cloud Control Center, you tell Cloud Control Center what existing infrastructure in your network do you want to onboard under the control of Virtual Edge from a policy perspective. Give it its IP address, TACACS credentials, or basic creds, and it now knows what infrastructure it needs to onboard into Elisity. And what it does is it turns your switching infrastructure, whether that's the access layer or the aggregation layer, or really any switch, or even we support onboarding wireless LAN controllers now as a enforcement point. I just went ahead of myself, but it turns the switches into both an enforcement point as well as a sensor for the network. We're leveraging existing technology in these switches at scale to identify exactly what's on the network in real time, pull that metadata out of the switching infrastructure and into our platform to be analyzed by Cloud Control Center and all the intelligence that Piotr can talk about later on that exists in Cloud Control Center. At the same time, it's receiving policy from the Cloud Control Center that you build and distributes this across your infrastructure where it needs to be, where it's relevant. That intelligence exists between the virtual edge and the cloud control center. So you see what we're doing, right? This is why it's so easy to onboard. You're not having to manipulate VLANs, change IP addresses on your devices. You're not having to deploy any new VRFs or change your topology, nothing. Whatever your network setup is looking like now, we're going to onboard it like that, and it's going to read the network and start pulling the data in, and then building enforcement into the switches. We'll go into how that's done in a moment. I know that's a burning question. I can see it in some of your eyes. How's it done?
Yeah.
Yeah, but I have to set the stage here, right? I want you to understand our approach is being adopted at mass because of how simple it is and how you still get all the value you expect from a microsegmentation perspective in this pre-packaged simple implementation. Now, before I go on to talk more about the virtual edge and the switches and how we onboard and everything, I just want to mention, well, I have to mention IdentityGraph, not only because I'm a product manager for IdentityGraph, but because it's core to our solution. It's core to our customers. As they're building policies, they're in IdentityGraph all the time. They're looking at all the easily digestible IdentityGraph outputs that provide identity information about the assets, context, flow information, mapping, user identity information, everything in one spot, so they can leverage that data for building their policies and their match criteria. Now, IdentityGraph is extremely extensible. We designed it to be able to connect to anything. Today, we support a plethora of connectors, we call them, I should say, to third parties to collect information. So, for example, I mentioned a couple of them before, but Clarity, Metagate, Armis, Tenable, CrowdStrike, these are all applications or third-party apps that we can pull identity from. This is actually a smaller view of it. We have quite a bit more. And we also have a massive list that I manage, the product managed side of it, a massive list of these connectors I have to deliver before a certain period of time for our customers. So I'm under a little stress, but I'm going to get it done. But we can also, as I mentioned before, connect to existing databases. This is an interesting one. A lot of customers have their own database they manage, and they want to pull that data into a platform. So we have a framework that's published that customers can abide by within their databases that allows us to pull and query and get the information we need when we need it. Yes, question.
So is that through an API?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. This is, all these connectors are as simple as going to I'll show you the connector spot, you're giving a token and the credentials, and it calls home. Right? We'll call home.
Are you involved in like technology partner type programs with those companies, or are you?
That's my life.
They're public.
That is my life. I sit down and I talk to these vendors all day long. I've made friends with so many of them, and so many of them are incredible people, incredible technologies. We're so honored to work with all of them. Yes, I work with them. I understand their platform. I read their APIs and understand how they work, and then I work with my engineers to deliver that as a simple API connector. It's as simple as putting in the details and it's done.
Dana, if I might,
yes, please.
Because the connectors are actually not required, and maybe just to go to the previous slide, if I might. So the Cloud Control Center, I was talking about 40 Radius servers in some of the environments, or 100 Radius servers. This is when we are talking about time to value.
Yeah.
The Cloud Control Center basically replaces it for you. You can think about it as a, it's not a Radius server. We're actually not using a Radius server, but you can think about it as a NAC server as a service. You don't need to worry yourself. Your teams, they do not need to worry about the scale, how many microservices are running behind the scenes, do you need 5 microservices, 20, 30? This is on us.
Yes.
And this is the first element of the core element of us achieving quick time to value. The virtual edge, this is the second component. We take the complexity of integrating with the networks. Arista, we were talking.
Yeah, we're going to get into that, yep.
We take this complexity out of your hands. You don't need to worry about how do you interact with iOS 15.6 because it has certain legacy type of device tracking capabilities. You don't need to worry about what changed between Cisco 15.7 and 16.3 and 16.3 and 7.6. This is where our teams, this is where I come in with my amazing team that I'm very honored to build, where we have folks who've spent on this decades, years, and we are basically abstracting it out for you. Arista, that switch, that platform, that version, Juniper.
Yep.
We will be talking about this data plane integrations. Dana will be talking about this in a moment. But I think this is the great moment to kind of just draw the overall picture. Cloud Control Center, Virtual Edge. Yes.
So comment and question on that. Scott Robon,
I think a lot of us think natively from the network layer. No disrespect to my more security literate colleagues here on the panel, but like get to the meat on this. Like how, like from a switch port perspective, how do you work with complement? Help us understand how are you solving that problem and interacting with the network layer. Sorry to be impatient.
It's okay. No, it's fine. And we're going to go into that right now. I can go into it right away.
You are going to it?
Yes, it's all part of this next slide. You're one slide ahead of me.
Okay.
Yes.
I've not seen any of your slides, so.
Yes. No, that's okay. Go ahead.
So Dana will describe how the assets are being detected in a moment, and maybe I will jump in on this
please
as well. But I just wanted to highlight that once the assets, actually go to the identity graph slide. Thank you. So once the asset is being discovered, and Dana will talk a little bit about the magic behind the scenes, I just wanted to highlight that this third-party connector integration, it's not required. We actually we have invested, and we are continuously investing a lot of resources into our own native discovery capabilities, looking at things like basic things like MAC addresses, the DHCP packets, the behavior of the flow of the device, like what ports and protocols is it using, which IP addresses it is communicating with. So we are actually able to quite accurately, we have accuracy above 90% in terms of classifying devices properly to say, this is a printer, this is a PC, this is a batch reader, this is a medical device, this is an IoT, OT device. So I just wanted to highlight that the connectors are bringing in additional context. There are companies who specialized in medical devices. Our goal is not to compete with Medigate, for instance. They spent 10 years just mapping the medical devices, but we are able to do quite a good job immediately once we connect to the network. And you were explaining how quickly we are able to do proof of value. This is mainly because of that, right? Even without any integrating with ServiceNow, Medigate, Clarity, Active Directory, we are able to show to our customers immediately what's on the network. And
it's perfect.
Maybe you can say what's the magic behind this.
Yeah, it's actually, you can see who manages what within this company, right? I'm really proud of these connectors. But yeah, absolutely, there's no requirement to have all these connectors. You can still get a significant amount of visibility into your assets using our identity engine that's built into our product. Thank you, Piotr. All right, so now we're going to get into the things that you want to talk about. How do we integrate? How do we do this, right? So, of course, we have Cloud Control Center, we have Virtual Edge. I think you guys just spoke to Arista right before this, right? You guys talked to them? I think we're meeting with them here soon. So today, we support Arista, Cisco, and Juniper. Now, of course, there's the details are in there, right? We have to talk about those details. But the Virtual Edge can connect directly to your switching infrastructure, for example, with Cisco. With Cisco, we'll integrate directly with switching infrastructure via, and depending on the switch type, it could be SSH, through SSH, and pulling the information that's within that switch, whether it's a Cisco device tracker data or DNS or DHCP, any metadata we can pull off flows through NetFlow, and we can analyze that. We're pulling that into our platform for our analysis. So that's like a direct integration with a switch. And the Virtual Edge handles all that. It logs into it, onboards it, logs into it. And actually, to answer your question in detail, it's going to, when it onboards, it reaches in there, and it configures a base set of functionality on the switch to extract the data we need. So for example, NetFlow collector configuration, it'll get put on there. Initially, earlier on, we configured span, ER span. But with Cisco, we realized that actually we don't need that. There's a lot of native intelligence in the Cisco switch we can pull out of using specific show output commands or APIs or whatever is available to us to glean that data out of the switch, right? Native embedded information in the switch we're pulling, okay? For Arista, today we have a similar integration directly with your Arista switch using eAPI, their current API. But we're actually currently working on an integration with CloudVision, so it's a little more of a seamless cloud-to-cloud integration. It's even simpler to deploy. And with Juniper, I actually really love their integration. Mist is pretty cool. It was my first chance to ever work with Mist while building this integration, helping build this integration. But Cloud Control Center integrates directly with Mist to pull the data out of Mist. The data that we need from the network is pulled directly from Mist, not into the switches. Does that make sense? So it depends on the hardware vendor.
So Dakota here. Is there going to be an option to go out of the Mist infrastructure, like right to the traditional Juniper equipment?
Today is not how we integrate. It's not out of the realm of possibility because we've already figured that out with Cisco and Arista. If that's a requirement for a customer, we could do it, right? We could add it to the roadmap and make that work. Yeah, probably has something to say about that. He's coming over.
We've built our platform with extensibility in mind, right? Like, so basically, network can have overlay, doesn't need to have overlay. Our goal is basically to abstract all of that out, right? Because we assume that the networks are not only Cisco, not only Arista, there's almost always a mix, there are acquisitions happening, right? And what we want to do is basically abstract it out. And yeah, we are having this translation layer, we call it hardware abstraction layer, where the policies are kind of in this meta language, and we convert them into policies as well as, the device discovery, right? You mentioned device tracking for newer iOS. For older, it was called IP device tracking or legacy device tracking. For Arista, we will be doing span. We don't want this to be your problem. This is what we are basically taking care of. So, yes, Udena mentioned, even though today we are not integrating directly with Juniper, because frankly speaking, our customers, the ones who want us to integrate with Juniper, they use Mist, and this was the preferred way. If there will be a need, we'll be adding such capability.
Yeah, Mist is a great, don't get me wrong, Mist is great, but so far it doesn't feel like it's scaling up enough for maybe the bigger organizations and stuff that are implementing this. So, speaking from experience, Mist doesn't offer options for our organization, right? At our scale. So,
yeah, no, it's a good point to make, and anything that our customers are looking for us to do, we can look at doing, right? Like I said before, our platform was built through design partners and the challenges they faced, and if this was a design partner integration or a relationship, totally, we could make it happen, right? That's again part of my job. I want to highlight something that.
Sorry, maybe one quick story on this. Like for instance, adding the data planes. I think we were talking about Hirschman, for instance, right? So there was a customer, with a requirement that we have a Hirschman switches. Hirschman is basically like a Cisco IE, manufacturing switch. And the question was, can you integrate with it? And I think, it took us a month. After a week, we had the POC. After a month, we had the production grade implementation. So with the abstraction layers. Sorry, I will be talking about abstraction layers. I'm very proud of, the architecture behind the scenes. I would love to spend 17 hours talking to you about it. But yeah, with our abstractions layers, I think we can basically connect with any data plane vendor.
Yeah. I'll go the other way with the question. So with Cisco, it looks like you kind of integrate directly, and you're, I guess, doing screen scraping through SSH. Something. Are you looking to integrate to their management platforms like Catalyst Center and Meraki Dashboard as a more sort of modern method to interface with their devices?
Yes, absolutely. A lot of the customers we've spoken to, specifically on the Meraki side, actually, have asked us to integrate with Meraki and to pull out data. As you know, Meraki switches are really kind of a really closed box. A lot of that management and that visibility happens from their cloud. So that would be more of a cloud-to-cloud integration. We've already discovered that and looked into it, and it's very, very viable. And we'll develop that as we see fit based on the customer requirements. DNA Center specifically, or Catalyst Center, I guess they call that. Now, it's, of course, their platform is also very extensible. And so a lot of the things that we do today with Mist, Cloud Vision, will be available if a customer had really required that. So basically, there's no limitation, right? Because of the way we architected Virtual Edge and made it so universal, it's really up to how we build the API connectivity to these other platforms and pull that data in. In the end, it's going to be the same no matter what vendor it is, right? From the perspective of the customer as they're building policies. And what I wanted to highlight, and actually Piotr highlighted it for me, which I'm thankful for, but the Virtual Edge I think of it like a ubiquitous policy plane, right? You don't have to worry about, you can even have like Arista, Cisco, Juniper, all working together in the same environment. And all you're doing is building the same one policy on our platform, and it figures it out for you. I love that. I think that's such a cool, it's such a cool methodology. You never have to worry about the infrastructure anymore. Just worry about your policy.
And sorry, last comment on this, and because you are bringing up some of the philosophical concepts that I mean, the way we are thinking about the platform and security in general. As I mentioned, I've spent 2 decades in cybersecurity, and I've seen situations where you have, for instance, 7 different platforms where you configure policy, like Panorama, you will have DNA Center, you will have SD-WAN solution. And the reality is that, and I've seen it multiple times, that the policy is, for instance, pushed by the security team in the wrong place. right? You have a compliance requirement to block A from talking to B. And then the security person will go into Panorama and deploy such policy. But the reality is that traffic never goes through this firewall to which the policy was pushed, right? This happens, and this is the reality, right? That the compliance is green, policy to prevent certain traffic is deployed, but on the wrong stuff, right? So what we are actually trying to do as a company, and I would love to talk about it in depth on the non-recorded session in terms of, what are some of the Horizon 2, Horizon 3 things that we are looking into, and I would love to hear your feedback on that. But this is not a mystery that we are actually looking into how can we unify this policy. So, the security team can push the policy in the platform, and it's our job to push it in the proper place in the network. Will it be firewall? Will it be, access switch, right? Some of it doesn't exist today, but this is kind of our philosophy, where we are trying to abstract out completely the security policies from a network.
I will say that actually interesting thing you mentioned, firewalls. People already have Palo Altos and Fortinets in their network, usually at the perimeter. And I worked on an integration here that's now coming to production of an integration of IdentityGraph with Panorama and FortiManager, Fortinet FortiManager, to share the intelligence that we know about assets at the edge with their platform. So they can build dynamic rules that are automatically updated by the knowledge that we have, the real-time knowledge that we have, and so that they don't have to build these very broad sets of rules that are not really solving all the corner cases, right? So we're able to share our intelligence from a host perspective, from an asset perspective, into those platforms and dynamically populate their rule sets at the perimeter as well. So the stuff that they don't have visibility into, we can provide them some visibility, and that's integration that's pretty cool. Oh, before we go any further, we talked a lot about the way we collect identity and collect information and use it, but we didn't talk about enforcement. How are we enforcing? I know that's a question that's in your mind. And what technology are we using? Well, it really depends on the platform, right? Piotr had mentioned Hirschman does things one way, Cisco does things another way, Juniper does things another way, et cetera. However, one interesting commonality across these major vendors like Arista, Cisco, and Juniper is that they have a mechanism, which I'm sure you're familiar with if you know these platforms, that's built into the ASICs that have been there for 10 years, that haven't been leveraged by, at scale gracefully. And so for Cisco, this ASIC level enforcement, hardware level enforcement that we're programming is technology that they call TrustSec, right? We're using components of TrustSec, only the components that we need to do what we do with our platform. Juniper, they use GBP. Arista, MSS. Hirschman is something else. I don't know, he built the Hirschman one. Hirschman is probably something a little different. Actually, honestly, Hirschman behind the scenes is Cisco, so they're probably using some Cisco technology, right? Anyways, does that make sense on there? But again, you don't have to worry about that. How do tags get pushed? How do they get mapped? Where they're used, where they're reused, et cetera? We're handling that. Our platform, our cloud, is doing this mapping and distribution of these tags and policies and information into the switches for you. Now, there's a couple ways to deploy a virtual edge and onboard your switching infrastructure. This is an architectural question, right? Well, okay, great, Dana. I have Cisco at my aggregation and at my edge. I can onboard all of them if I want. I can get that first entry into the network, the first packet that hits the network, I can enforce right there. Identify and enforce right there. Fantastic, I love that. We can do enforcement within the same VLAN on the same switch using these ASIC-based enforcement technologies. It's incredible, absolutely amazing technology that we're leveraging. But some customers may not have infrastructure that we support for enforcement right there at the access layer. And I come across this relatively often in manufacturing environments, customers. They might have at the aggregation layer a Cisco 9500 or a 9300, but downstream at the access layer they have a Moxa, and they have a Netgear, and they have a Allen Bradley, and they have like a mixture of things. Whatever was cheapest at the time to get that OT product right. You got somebody who understands it. OT product connected to the network. And so what we realized is that For customers that leverage this type of architecture, most of the time, they're not trying to enforce within a single switch, within the same VLAN, right down here. They're trying to understand enforcement between manufacturing lines that are dedicated to switches that eventually come up to the aggregation point anyways. So any traffic that egresses this switch, which is pretty much going to be everything, anything that's not localized to that switch is going to egress and go up to your aggregation point, and we're going to be able to collect the data there. We're going to be able to enforce there as well. And so that has solved like 95% of the use cases we come across that have this type of scenario, because they care about the manufacturing process here communicating with the manufacturing process here, communicating with another site outside doing manufacturing in like Singapore or China or something. And so we can collect and do all that at the ag. Does that make sense? Another thing to point out here is that, and this is getting a little bit into the weeds, and I know you guys like weeds. So this is, this switch right here, you might have 4 or 5 devices on the same VLAN and 6 on another VLAN. If there's lateral movement trying to happen between VLANs, how does that happen? If it's a layer 2 switch, where does it go? It goes up here, right? Mm-hmm. So we're going to see it again. So even if you have assets on the same switch that we don't support, but they're in different VLANs, we're still going to be able to collect them and do enforcement. So now it brings that we solve for even more of the use cases. Does that make sense? There's maybe like 1 or 2% of the use cases we're not going to solve for. Okay, whatever. We'll figure out something else to deal there, right? It's quite a universal architectural application.
Is Elisity also using digital twin type capabilities to provide?
This is a great question for Piotr because he's worked on that. Amazing.
It's a secret. It's a secret. Yeah. I mean, digital twins were my passion, and there were some of the projects I was working on that I cannot really speak. Especially, I mean, we can talk about it maybe later on. But yeah, there is a digital twin-alike capability that we are building in our system to kind of understand what's where and what's the best place to push the policy, right? Like, if there's a traffic between host A and B, like what are the best enforcement points to push the policy to, right? Like, is it a firewall, or is it a switch? Is it a wireless controller, right? Like, again, not an easy problem. This is something that we are working on.
Can you use it as a full simulation, or not that far yet?
I mean, and you will be showing it during the demo, right? Mm-hmm. Like, yes, we do have a capability of simulating what type of traffic, for instance, will be dropped, right? This is part of our implementation process, right? Nobody turns on segmentation Friday afternoon with one button for all of the assets, right? This doesn't happen. It's a continuous process. Usually it starts with, low impact policies, like, we'll block printers from talking to batch readers on day 1, for instance. Yep. Then, and Dana will be showing it in a moment. Our platform, if you think about it from, for instance, in Cisco vocabulary, it will embed, StealthWatch, Cisco StealthWatch, and ICE in one place. So you will see this very cool view where you have this policy matrix with a traffic overlay on top of it. And there is actually a concept which we call exactly simulation mode, where you can start with like, I think next week I'm going to deploy this policy, that will block the printers from talking to batch readers. Yes. You monitor it throughout the week. What will be dropped?
Happen, right?
Right.
Yeah. Right.
Then you review it, and like it looks fine. Like there's, these packets, this is like a MDNS. This should be dropped anyways. And you have this confidence, and you were talking about it, Dana. Yeah. This is what we build the platform based on. Our experience. What do the operators need to feel confident to press the button, right? And yeah,
very good question. Okay.
Is this implying, see the switches, is it implying firewall consolidation in terms of using the Elisity technology?
Yeah, we've had that come up. Some of the use cases we've come across we have been able to solve for that. Depends on how the firewall is being used. If you're using a firewall at the edge or the perimeter, for a DMZ, we're not dealing with that, right? Firewalls are designed incredibly for that. But what firewalls are not designed for, and where they're not strategically placed, is at the axis and for lateral movement. That's usually what we're solving for. But the interesting thing is that a lot of the customers we talk to before they meet us, we're like, oh yeah, we're going to spend like $10 million on firewalls across our entire infrastructure to do lateral movement. And then they come to us like, oh, we can just use our existing switching infrastructure we spent $10 million on last year? Hell yeah, right? It's a no-brainer for them. So for that use case, absolutely. But I would never recommend, honestly, I would never say, yeah, we're going to replace your firewalls. It's not designed to do that.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, so we coexist in the ecosystem, right? There are places where firewalls are the best because, for instance, Switch cannot do L7 inspection. Sometimes you might want to do L7 inspection, right? So we are not fully replacing the firewalls, but there are places where firewalls belong. There are places where they don't, and this is the balance we're trying to keep. So we are part of the ecosystem, and for sure we wouldn't come in here and say that we are going to replace Palo Alto. No, right?
No.
But we will coexist, right?
Yeah. Yeah. Fantastic questions because it's just priming me up for some of these next slides. This is the last slide you're going to talk about before we show you a demo of the platform, okay? And show you the UI. Just a little flow of what's it like for customers to use our product in end to end. If you want to get the whole picture end to end, here it is. Devices are accessing the network, whether they exist today or they exist tomorrow. It doesn't matter. We're going to detect that. We do our device discovery, our native device discovery, as well as the enrichment through our identity graph connectors. We pull all that into identity graph. Our product is immediately in learning mode from the moment you deploy it. We're immediately collecting and mapping the flows to the users and devices and the policy groups that either were pre-created by us or created by you guys. So that's happening day one. So after 15, 20 minutes, you're already seeing all your assets and all the application traffic that's being pulled in during that period of time. Then you start to build out your policies, your policy groups, match criteria to group these assets into what makes sense for your business to apply policy to them at scale. And you can start building your policies, but you don't have to enforce them just yet. That's the answer to the simulation question. You can build these policies, let them sit there in the control plane, and the system will evaluate all the flows from all these different assets as it goes through the platform and map them to your policies so you can know exactly what asset, where in a network will be affected and what is being affected, what traffic flows, which application flows are being affected, right? And when you're ready, okay, you can selectively enforce. And this is the beauty of our solution. You can enforce super granularly down to the asset, based on a business unit, based on a remote site. It's really up to you how you want to deploy and deliver your microsegmentation to your organization based on the velocity you can support. And so it's very granular, our approach to both identifying, creating policy, and then deploying these policies. Yes?
Yeah, John Freeman here. It seems to me that the scalability, potential scalability limiter is the identity graph database. So I was kind of curious, what's the structure behind that database? Like, it's open source.
Let's have him answer because he built identity graph.
Okay.
And I have my own answer, but let him answer on that.
Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, so is the question on the more like how is it implemented? Like
No,
scalability?
like just identity graph. How was it built? Did you use, I don't know, an open source database, or did you build?
Yeah. I mean, it's actually in full transparency. It's based on behind the scenes. It's Postgres that we are using for identity graph. It's JSON B field. It's super scalable in Postgres. We have, I mean, there are many companies that battle tested, Postgres with JSON implementation for billions of records. Frankly, we will not have so many records. You will have 500,000 million asset in the largest organization. So this has been very well stress tested. We think that there's a huge buffer that we are having, right? So actually, identity graph database, you might think that there's a lot of data, but for the largest companies that we are having deployed, like for instance, 400,000 assets, the database is 60 megabytes. That's it. This is, you think it's a lot of data, metadata, but when you really think about the number of bytes or kilobytes, this is really not that big, right? Yeah. So from this perspective, this
and
is
it's single tenant, so
right.
Obviously, so you're not you've eliminated that scale. Okay.
We could share this. This has been more a security-driven decision, right? Our customers, they do not want their data,
but it's a side benefit.
Yeah.
Yes, they don't want the same data, their data to sit in the same Postgres database instance as their competitor, for instance, right? So these are separate tenants, separate VPCs. If we're using AWS vocabulary, for instance,
Yeah, very good. Great question. Thank you.